Are six of the best buy low options for you guys to go out and trade for before week 3 of the fantasy season. Let's break each player down. All right, no surprise here. We're starting with Brian Thomas of the Jacksonville Jaguars. What a disastrous start to the 2025 season for Brian Thomas after being a player you selected at the end of the first round, beginning of the second round of your drafts, and after he finished as the wide receiver 4 in full PPR last year. 9 fantasy points in week 1 and just 8.9 last week, and pretty good matchups here against the Panthers and the Bengals to start the season. And, it's a good matchup on paper here in week 3 against the Texans, who have given up the 23rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers so far on the season. But we don't exactly know where Derek Stingley is going to line up in this game, if it's going to be against Brian Thomas or if it's going to be against Travis Hunter. But I'm going to assume it'll probably be against Brian Thomas. So I'm not exactly expecting a big week for Brian Thomas in week 3. But, the issues with Brian Thomas aren't really based on like opportunity or anything. He had 7 targets in week 1, 12 targets in week 2. The issues are that, there's been a lot of drops. He's supposedly dealing with a wrist injury. The chemistry between him and Trevor Lawrence to start the season hasn't been there. We've heard all kinds of different things about Brian Thomas here early in the season, but I still believe as the season starts to progress, some of this is going to go away, and he will still be the most heavily targeted player on this team, that he can get back to some of that production that we saw last year that made him a true league winner. So I'm just not in this boat of like doom for Brian Thomas. I've seen him be sold in leagues very low, especially in dynasty communities. If you guys have an opportunity to go trade for Brian Thomas in dynasty, absolutely do it. I don't think this guy's career is over just because we're 2 weeks into the season and things aren't going according to plan, but I think ultimately Brian Thomas is still a player who can be a true league winner. And don't forget, anytime we have a player, drafted at the end of the first, beginning of the second, who drops down in value to where people are willing to trade him at a low price and he can become a flex option for you on your roster, you really want to try and take advantage of that. And I don't think the market's ever been lower for a player like Brian Thomas, albeit he's still, very early into his career. So I don't exactly think you have to give up a lot for Brian Thomas, but I do think a big game could come at any moment because he's had at least 7 targets in each of the first 2 games on the season. So I'm buying low on Brian Thomas right now. I don't know if it's going to be a huge week 3 necessarily, but I still think just due to the opportunity that he's getting, we can see that production come back. So right now is still a very, very good time to try and acquire Brian Thomas before his value potentially rises. Next up, we have rookie running back Omarion Hampton of the LA Chargers, who's also started the season in very disappointing fashion after he just absolutely skyrocketed in ADP through the end of draft season. But so far, we've seen 8.1 fantasy points in week 1, 3.5 in week 2 for Hampton. And ultimately, we have to look at a few things here, right? This is a rookie running back. I mean, we want to keep that in mind. It's not like we have these expectations of every rookie running back is going to be Saquon Barkley right away, right? And ultimately, he's faced 2 really good run defenses. Kansas City in week 1, and believe it or not, the Raiders are top 5 against the running back position in fantasy points allowed so far in the season, and he doesn't particularly get a great matchup here in week 3 against the Denver Broncos as well, but it's a little bit better in terms of rankings. But also, what you need to keep in mind is the first 2 weeks of the season, this is a Greg Roman offense. I mean, traditionally, this is an offense that runs the football first and foremost, but first 2 weeks of the season, they knew that they were going up against good front sevens, and like we saw, they decided to throw the football a ton through the first 2 weeks of the season with 27 or more passing attempts from Justin Herbert, 34 in week 1, 27 in week 2. And I think we can still get some matchups like that. Don't get me wrong, it's been working, but there are still going to be a lot of games this year where the Chargers want to run the football first and foremost. We did get a little bit more involvement out of Najee Harris last week, and actually the split was about 50-50. 8 touches on the ground for Hampton, 2 targets, and exactly 8 touches for Najee and 2 targets last week as well. So, I mean, I'm not really surprised by that. I was in the boat that Najee was always going to have involvement here, but ultimately what we want to look at is that the schedule starts to clear up a lot in the next coming weeks. The Giants in week 4, the Dolphins in week 6, the Titans in week 9, the Steelers in week 10, the Jags in week 11. There are much better matchups coming. I will say the Chargers have a tough end of season stretch. Las Vegas, Philly, Kansas City, Dallas, good. Then Houston. So most of those matchups tough, but ultimately, I still think Hampton could be a very productive player this year. Don't forget, in Jahmyr Gibbs' rookie season, he took some time to get going, right? And it wasn't, until later in the season in his rookie year where we really started to see him go. I mean, through the first 4 weeks of Jahmyr Gibbs' rookie season, he had 12.6 or less fantasy points. Then he missed weeks 5 and 6 before just absolutely exploding after that and only giving you single digits 2 more times on the season. So I still think Hampton, a great player, great prospect, still in a good position, and a lot of fantasy managers are panicking on him. We want to take advantage of that while we can. All right, next up we have Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, who I honestly thought was going to have a big week in week 2. That did not happen. Just 9 fantasy points after a monster 22.5 fantasy day in week 1. But I still think Garrett Wilson is a player who a lot of people absolutely need to try and go acquire on their fantasy squads because, this is once again a player who got drafted as like a 3rd round, maybe 4th round value, but for most of you guys, a 3rd round value, who I think right now the consensus is low on. And you have an opportunity to go out and make him a potential flex player for you. And I think that right now with Justin Fields set to miss week 3 and the uncertainty with Tyrod Taylor at the quarterback position, I don't exactly know what we're going to get out of Garrett Wilson in week 3, but I'm willing to bet against the Tampa Bay secondary that was not good last year. That's bottom 10 so far in the season in fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. That Tyrod Taylor is going to have to rely on veteran wide receiver Garrett Wilson, and I think he's just still going to be a very solid wide receiver 2 or flex option for you guys throughout the course of the season. But with him coming off of a bad game, with the uncertainty at the quarterback position, this is when we want to try and strike for a trade, try and buy him low. Garrett Wilson is going to have plenty of good games this year. I firmly believe that the talent has outweighed the situation with Garrett Wilson, regardless of the quarterback position throughout his career. And we look at the schedule here against Miami in week 4, Dallas in week 5, overall, this is the week to go and make a move for Garrett Wilson because even if it's not a huge week 3, which I still think is a good opportunity on the road against Tampa Bay, like I said, weeks 4 and 5, I guarantee you Garrett Wilson strikes with double digits. So go trade for him now. The consensus is very low. The Jets had an awful week 2. Regardless of if it's Fields or if it's Tyrod Taylor or the way Fields played in week 2, I don't really care. Garrett Wilson is just such a talented player. And if you can make him a flex option for your fantasy team, he is definitely going to be able to come through for your guys' rosters. Next up, we have Jordan Mason of the Minnesota Vikings, and I don't know if you're necessarily buy low on Jordan Mason. I still think that there's definitely an opportunity to do so, but I would argue the consensus overall is pretty high on Mason with Aaron Jones, sent to IR with that hamstring injury. We know he's going to miss at least 4 games, right? And that's obviously great news if you're a Jordan Mason owner. So this one could be a little bit tricky, but I do think with the way that the Vikings offense has looked through the first 2 games of the season with J.J. McCarthy at quarterback and now Carson Wentz coming in at quarterback. We'll see how it shakes out here. The consensus on the Vikings offense as a whole is definitely a tad bit lower right now, and we've only seen 8.5 or less fantasy points from Jordan Mason in each of the first 2 games, albeit, Aaron Jones is essentially healthy for both these games, and week 2 was not a game script where they needed to throw the football in a game where Aaron Jones did, miss part of the game. So, take that with a grain of salt, but I think you could use that potentially in your trade negotiations. But here in week 3, it's a smash matchup at home for Jordan Mason going up against the Bengals, who've given up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the season. So I just don't necessarily know if you guys will be able to make a decent trade for Jordan Mason after this week, because if he does have a big game, which I think he will, it's just going to be a lot more difficult to trade for him, right? So listen, I don't exactly know how this is going to look with Carson Wentz at quarterback. They may rely on the run. I do think that they're going to have to establish the run game, and they will be able to against the Bengals, but you never know with a backup quarterback going in how things are going to look. But we do know Kevin O'Connell, great head coach, has done a lot of good work with iffy quarterbacks throughout his career. So I like this spot for Jordan Mason. I think it'd be a lot more difficult to trade for Mason after week 3. So go out, get an offer in now before he potentially has a very big game against the Bengals. All right, let's take a look at a veteran wide receiver. That's Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, getting a week 3 matchup against the Raiders, who've been bottom 5 against the wide receiver position thus far on this season. Terry McLaurin has only had 9.8 or less fantasy points through each of the first 2 games on the season, and we've really seen Deebo Samuel be the most productive wide receiver on this team, not to mention Zach Ertz played very well at the tight end position. And now we're going into week 3, this home game for the Commanders, with a big question mark around Jaden Daniels. Time of recording this, we still don't know if he's going to play or not this weekend. I do believe if Marcus Mariota is the starting quarterback for the Commanders, that helps in terms of a potential buy low on Terry McLaurin. But what I want to look at here is for the long term, I think Terry McLaurin is in a very good spot ultimately, and is still a wide receiver who's going to come on and have a lot of production in this offense. Like I said, I know it's been a little shaky to start the year, but let's face it, he wasn't really necessary in week 1. And then in week 2, he did have 9 targets, and that was against a very good Packers defense. Like I said, Deebo, Ertz were able to come through that game. It was a game script where the Commanders needed to throw the football. It's not like McLaurin was awful statistically at 9.6 yards per catch off of 5 total catches and 9 targets. So the overall production is still potentially there, even if Deebo and Zach Ertz are eating into it. And now, we know we're probably going to run game going here with Bill as a clear-cut RB1, but no Eckler. More opportunities in terms of the passing game. But once again, if Mariota is the starting quarterback here in week 3, I think that's good in terms of trade negotiations, and it could potentially help because I don't know if McLaurin's going to have a huge week 3, but the matchup is still there. And once again, these backup quarterbacks, when they come in, they do like to rely on veteran players like a Terry McLaurin, like a Garrett Wilson. So I do think that this is a good spot for Terry regardless, but the consensus could be a little bit lower if Jaden Daniels is not healthy this weekend. So Terry McLaurin, just once again, a player that I believe in. Don't forget he missed, all of the offseason training camp, had the holdout and everything. So it's not surprising to me that he's taken a little bit of time to get going here early in the season. But ultimately, this is still a player who's going to have a lot of very productive weeks throughout the course of the season. If you could turn him into a flex option on your team, you guys absolutely need to try and do so. All right, last player I want to go over is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. One more veteran wide receiver for you guys. And we have to look at the start of the season as just unfortunate for Evans because, he's only had 10.6 or less fantasy points in each of the first 2 games, but he has faced AJ Terrell in week 1, Derek Stingley in week 2, Sauce Gardner in week 3. Then in week 4, he's going to face the Eagles and their stud quarter, Then in week 5, another stud quarter in Witherspoon and that Seattle defense. But it does lighten up after that as he's going to get San Fran, Detroit, and New Orleans. And ultimately, what we have to look at with Mike Evans, I know Emeka Egbuka, who I absolutely love, has kind of, overshadowed Evans here early in the season because he's been able to find the end zone. But Evans is still the leader in terms of targets on this team as well as receptions, and that's not going to change. We know he's the alpha wide receiver 1 on this team. Even when Chris Godwin comes back or potentially Jalen McMillan looming around, Egbuka's ahead of possibly both those guys, but definitely McMillan. There's still going to be plenty of opportunity for Mike Evans. I do have slight concerns because we saw another, offensive lineman injury for the Bucs, and they already were going into the year. No Tristan Wirfs, although he should be back soon, but I still really believe in this offense. It's my favorite offense in terms of the offseason. Still believe in Baker Mayfield and the ability of this offense to get into the red zone and put up a lot of points. And I think that, once again, we're going to see some really big fantasy days as a whole for this offense in some of these softer matchups. And once again, if the consensus is lower on Mike Evans and you could turn him into a flex option, how much better are you going to feel about your team when you have just a consistent, safe floor piece like Mike Evans and the flex who can always absolutely pop off for you guys. And overall, I really like the playoff schedule for the Buccaneers as well. Week 15, AJ Terrell, Atlanta, not as great, but that's a big divisional matchup late in the season, and that's a home game for the Bucs. Then they get the Panthers, then they get the Dolphins. I know the Panthers are kind of quietly okay on defense and everything. But I still ultimately, once again, another good divisional matchup end of the year. Then they end the fantasy season on the road against Miami. You got to like that. So I think Evans, once again, still a very good player, regardless of what's going on around him in terms of other wide receivers. This is still the true dominant number one wide receiver for the Bucs. He's just had a very unfortunate start to the season in terms of strength of schedule and number one corners that he has faced. And I don't know if that's going to change necessarily in weeks 3, 4, or 5, but while this window is here, you guys absolutely need to try and go buy low on Mike Evans while you can. And there you guys have it. There are my 6 players to go buy low on before week 3 of the fantasy season and before it's too late. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 3, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video as the week progresses. And while you're down there, it does the channel a huge favor if you guys hit that subscribe button on the way out. And don't forget, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. So if you're into that, be sure to subscribe. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, we have everything you could possibly need here on the channel to dominate week 3 of the season. So make sure you guys go check out some of the other videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.